Thomas Harrison never expected life to surprise him again at 72. After decades of military service and a lifetime of calculated decisions, he thought he knew exactly how his remaining years would unfold in his secluded mountain cabin. But on a crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves danced across his front porch, fate had other plans. A mud-covered golden retriever with soulful eyes and a slight limp would lead him to Catherine Windsor, a woman who had everything money could buy, but nothing that truly mattered. Their story isn't just about a lost dog finding its way home. It's about how two people, scarred by different battles, discover that life's most precious gifts often come disguised as simple twists of fate. In the quiet mountains of Vermont, where wealth means nothing and authenticity means everything, they're about to learn that sometimes the heart finds exactly what it needs in the most unexpected places. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first hint of the dog's presence came as a soft whimper carried on the morning breeze. Thomas had been sitting on his porch, coffee cup warming his hands against the autumn chill, when he heard it. Years of military training had taught him to trust his instincts, and something in that sound spoke of pain and desperation. He set down his coffee and stood slowly, joints protesting the sudden movement. The sound came again, clearer this time, from the edge of his property, where a carefully tended garden met the wild forest. Through the morning mist he caught a flash of golden fur. The dog emerged slowly from the fog, each step careful and measured. Its right front paw barely touched the ground, and its coat was matted with mud and forest debris. But there was something in its bearing, even injured, that spoke of good breeding and a loving home. Thomas's first aid kit was where it had always been, maintained with military precision even after all these years. He retrieved it from its shelf, the familiar weight bringing back memories of dusty medical tents and whispered prayers. Some skills never left you, even when the battlefield changed from Vietnamese jungle to Vermont mountainside. "Easy now," he murmured, descending the porch steps. The dog watched him approach, intelligent eyes assessing him with equal parts hope and wariness. Thomas had seen that look before, in wounded soldiers, in grieving widows, in his own reflection after Sarah passed. It was the look of someone who needed help but had forgotten how to ask for it. 15 minutes of patient coaxing brought the dog onto his porch, leaving muddy paw prints across the freshly swept boards. Thomas didn't mind. The dog followed him. Inside, its caution gradually giving way to trust as Thomas knelt beside it, joints creaking in protest. "Let's see what we've got here, buddy." His fingers, gentled by years of experience with wounded comrades, carefully examined the swollen paw. The dog winced but didn't pull away, seeming to sense Thomas's expertise. No break, thankfully. Just a nasty sprain and some cuts that spoke of a long journey through rough terrain. The first aid kit's latches caught slightly before clicking open, revealing neat rows of supplies. Thomas cleaned the wounds with practiced efficiency, speaking softly all the while. "Back in '69, had a sergeant with worse feet than you after 3 days in the jungle. Fixed him up just fine." The dog's tail thumped against the floor, either appreciating the story or just the sound of a kind voice. As he wrapped the paw with precise, practiced movements, Thomas studied the dog's collar. Leather, expensive, the kind you'd find in a boutique pet shop, not a rural supply store. No tags, though. "Someone's missing you," he said softly, running his hand along the dog's neck. "Someone with means." The thought stirred something in Thomas's chest, a familiar ache he usually kept safely buried. He knew about missing people, about empty spaces where loved ones should be. His eyes drifted to the small shelf above his wood stove, where Sarah's picture sat in its simple frame. 10 years since cancer had taken her, but some days it felt like yesterday. That evening, after a battle with bath time that left both man and dog soaked but victorious, Thomas found himself with company for the first time in years. The dog, temporarily christened Doc, for his patient participation in the medical proceedings, lay curled by the wood stove, his bandaged paw tucked carefully beneath him. Thomas settled into his usual chair, the leather worn to the shape of his body, after countless solitary evenings. But tonight, as he opened his book, he found himself reading aloud. "Call of the Wild," he told Doc. "Seems appropriate." The dog's ears perked up, and Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, filling the cabin with a story of adventure, loyalty, and finding one's place in an unexpected world. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Thomas Harrison fell asleep in his chair, book open on his lap, with the sound of another's breathing mixing with the crackle of the fire. Tomorrow, he would need to start searching for Doc's owner, but for tonight, the simple comfort of companionship was enough. Morning arrived with a symphony of birdsong and the unfamiliar sound of paws padding across wooden floors. Thomas opened his eyes to find Doc watching him expectantly, tail wagging, seemingly unbothered by yesterday's injury. The morning sun caught his now clean coat, revealing a rich golden color that spoke of careful breeding and regular grooming. "Guess we better figure out where you came from," Thomas said, reaching for his cane. His back protested the night spent in the chair, but there was a warmth in his chest that made the discomfort worthwhile. Doc followed him to the kitchen, matching his pace step for step as if he'd been doing it for years. The nearest veterinary clinic was in town, a 20-minute drive down the mountain. Thomas hadn't made the trip in months, preferring the solitude of his cabin to the well-meaning but persistent attempts at conversation from townspeople. But as he watched Doc devour the scrambled eggs he'd prepared for them both, he knew isolation wasn't an option today. The missing dog poster was already in his truck's glove box, carefully printed on his old desktop computer. The photo didn't do Doc justice. The dog in the picture was clearly the same animal, but the printed image couldn't capture the intelligence in those eyes, the dignified way he carried himself, even while injured. "Come on then," Thomas patted the truck's passenger seat, and Doc jumped up without hesitation, settling in as if he'd been riding shotgun his whole life. The drive down the mountain was different with company. Thomas found himself pointing out landmarks, sharing stories he hadn't thought about in years. "That's where the Henderson place used to be, before the fire of '82. Old man Henderson was convinced it was started by a UFO. Doc's ears perked up at each word, his head turning to follow Thomas's gestures. The veterinary clinic sat at the edge of town, a low brick building with a weathered sign and a small parking lot dotted with pickup trucks. Dr. Mary Chen had taken over the practice 5 years ago, when old Dr. Peterson retired. Thomas had met her exactly once, during the final days of his cat sergeant's life. She'd shown a kindness then that he hadn't forgotten. The bell above the door chimed as they entered. Doc's nails clicked against the linoleum floor. His bandaged paw held slightly aloft, despite his obvious excitement at the new surroundings. The waiting room was empty, except for a teenager texting behind the reception desk. "Mr. Harrison?" "Doctor." Chen emerged from the back, surprise evident in her voice. "It's been a while." Her eyes moved to Doc, professional assessment replacing surprise. "And who's this handsome fellow?" Thomas explained the situation as Dr. Chen examined Doc, her gentle hands checking his paw and replacing Thomas's bandage with fresh wrapping. "Nice work with the first aid," she commented. "Military medic?" "Vietnam," Thomas nodded. "Long time ago. Some skills stay with you." She ran a scanner over Doc's shoulder. "Good news, he's microchipped. Let me look up." The registration. The information that appeared on her computer screen made her eyebrows rise. "Well, this is interesting. He's registered to Windsor Estates in Boston. Name's Maxwell. Quite a fancy pedigree, too. French import. Championship bloodlines." She tilted her head. "Long way from home." Thomas looked at Doc. Maxwell, who met his gaze with the same steady intelligence he'd shown since their first meeting. A Boston dog, from wealth and privilege, somehow finding his way to a veteran's cabin in the Vermont mountains. The universe, he thought, had an interesting sense of humor. Dr. Chen was still reading. There's a contact number here for emergencies. The owner is listed as... She paused, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. Catherine Windsor, the Catherine Windsor. The media coverage of her divorce from that tech billionaire was all over the news last month. She printed out a sheet with the contact information, but her hand hesitated before passing it to Thomas. You know, we could handle this through official channels. Missing pets from prominent families can be complicated. Thomas took the paper, folding it carefully. He found me, he said simply. Least I can do is help him find his way back. Doc, Maxwell, pressed against his leg, as if in agreement. Back in the truck, Thomas studied the sheet. A phone number, an email address, and a Boston address that probably cost more than he'd earned in his entire military career. Beside him, Maxwell sat patiently, those knowing eyes fixed on his face. "Well, boy," Thomas said, reaching for his ancient flip phone, "let's see if we can get you home." But as he dialed the number, he felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. In just one day, the dog had filled a space in his life he hadn't even realized was empty. He wondered what kind of woman Catherine Windsor was, what kind of life Maxwell would return to, and why a dog with everything would choose to run so far from home. The divorce papers sat unopened on Catherine Windsor's desk, their presence an accusation in the stark morning light flooding her Boston penthouse. 48 hours had passed since Maxwell's disappearance, and the pristine apartment felt more like a mausoleum than a home. His empty bed lay untouched in the corner of her home office, his favorite tennis ball still nestled in its center. Any news from the search teams? Catherine pressed her phone closer to her ear, pacing the length of her floor-to-ceiling windows. 20 stories below, the city crawled with morning traffic, everyone rushing somewhere with purpose. Everyone. Except her. Nothing yet, Ms. Windsor. The private investigator's voice crackled through the speaker. We've covered most of the state parks within a 100-mile radius, but then expand the search. Catherine cut him off, her voice sharper than intended. She paused, running a hand through her salon-perfect hair. I'm sorry, James. It's just... He's all I have left. The words hung in the air, their truth stinging. At 45, Catherine Windsor had everything society claimed should make her happy. Wealth, status, freedom from a loveless marriage. The tabloids had called her divorce settlement historic, their headlines gleefully detailing every million Marcus had been forced to pay. None of them mentioned how hollow victory could taste. Maxwell had been her constant through it all, while Marcus buried himself in his tech empire and his 20-something assistant. Maxwell had curled up beside Catherine during sleepless nights. When the prenup negotiations turned vicious, he'd rested his head on her lap, those soulful eyes saying, more than any lawyer could. And now, the intercom buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. Ms. Windsor, the board meeting starts in 30 minutes. Tell them I'm not coming. Catherine's eyes fixed on a framed photo on her desk. Maxwell as a puppy, all paws and joy, the day she'd brought him home from France. Cancel everything for the week, but Ms. Windsor, the foundation's annual everything. She ended the call, silence settling back over the apartment like dust. The divorce papers seemed to mock her. Marcus's final attempt to reshape their narrative, demanding she step down from the Windsor Foundation's board in exchange for a bigger settlement. As if money could replace purpose. As if she hadn't spent the last decade building their charitable organization from a tax write-off into something meaningful. Catherine moved to the windows, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. Somewhere out there, Maxwell was lost and alone. Her mind tortured her with possibilities, highways, predators, exposure. He was a pampered city dog, accustomed to organic food and memory foam beds. How would he survive? Her phone vibrated, another news alert. She almost ignored it until she saw her own name in the headline, Windsor Heiress, from billion-dollar divorce to missing dog drama. Below was a photo of her leaving the courthouse last month, Maxwell proudly walking beside her. They'd made it through the media circus together, and now The sound of her laugh startled her, harsh and bitter in the empty apartment. The press would love this latest twist. Poor little rich girl, losing her dog after losing her husband. They'd probably call it karma. A soft ding from her laptop drew her attention, a new email from an unfamiliar address. Her finger hovered over the delete button. She'd had enough of reporters and their false sympathy, but something made her pause. "Dear Ms. Windsor, I believe I've found your dog, Maxwell." Catherine's hand shook as she read the message. A man in Vermont, of all places. A veteran living alone in the mountains. It seemed impossible. Maxwell, her perfectly groomed, perfectly trained companion, seeking refuge in some rustic cabin. Her credit card was in her hand before she finished reading, ready to book a private helicopter. But again, she paused, the divorce papers catching her eye. Marcus's voice echoed in her head. "You wouldn't survive a week without your privilege. Kathy, you're too soft, too dependent." She thought of Maxwell, surviving against the odds, finding his way in a world so different from their cushioned existence. Perhaps he was braver than she'd given him credit for. Perhaps they both were. Catherine reached for her phone again, but this time dialed a different number. "James, cancel the search teams." She looked at the email again, at the simple, honest words from this stranger who'd helped her dog without knowing who she was. "I need to do this myself." Thomas stared at his old landline phone, its copper-colored cord coiled like a sleeping snake on his desk. He'd never bothered upgrading to a wireless model. The cord had saved the handset from countless drops over the years, and besides, he liked having a physical connection to the world, something tangible to ground him when memories threatened to pull him adrift. Maxwell sat at attention beside his chair, watching Thomas's every move as if he understood the significance of this moment. The dog had perked up noticeably when Thomas first dialed the number from Dr. Chen's printout, but 3 attempts had gone straight to voicemail. Now, an hour later, Thomas's finger hovered over the keypad again. "Fourth time's the charm, eh?" he murmured to Maxwell, who responded with an encouraging tail wag. The numbers felt heavy under his fingers. A Boston area code, followed by 7 digits that would connect his quiet mountain life to a world of penthouses and private jets. This time, the line clicked after 2 rings. Catherine Windsor speaking. The voice was clear, cultured, with an undertone of something that reminded Thomas of wounded soldiers trying to sound strong, a fragility masked by determination. "Ms. Windsor," Thomas cleared his throat. "My name is Thomas Harrison. I sent you an email about Maxwell." The sharp intake of breath was audible even through the ancient phone line. Is he all right?" "He's fine, ma'am." Sprained pause. "Healing nicely. Been keeping him comfortable. Oh, thank God." The relief in her voice was genuine, causing Maxwell's tail to thump harder against the floor. "When you said Vermont in your email, how did he even get there?" "Can't rightly say. Found him yesterday morning, muddy and limping. Fixed him up. Best I could." Thomas watched as Maxwell moved closer, pressing against his leg. "He's a good dog, smart, seems to know his own mind." A soft laugh, slightly watery. "Yes, that sounds like Maxwell. He's always been—" She paused. "Mr. Harrison, I can send a car service immediately, or a helicopter would be faster." "No need for helicopters, ma'am," Thomas interrupted gently, years of medical training helping him keep his voice calm and steady. "Mountain weather's tricky this time of year. Besides, seems to me Maxwell's had enough excitement for a while." The silence that followed was thoughtful rather than awkward. When Catherine spoke again, her voice had lost some of its practiced polish. "You're right, of course. I could drive up myself. Tomorrow morning." Thomas glanced out his window, at the steep, unmarked road leading to his cabin. "Might be better if I meet you in town. Road up here can be treacherous if you don't know it. There's a diner, Caroline's. Best coffee in Vermont, though that's not saying much." Another laugh, more genuine this time. "Caroline's diner tomorrow at what time would suit you?" "Maxwell and I usually start our days early. Say 8? Maxwell and—" She caught herself. Yes, 8 would be perfect. There was a pause. Mr. Harrison, thank you, not just for finding him, but for caring. Thomas thought of the way Maxwell had trusted him from the start, of shared meals and quiet evenings by the fire. Been a pleasure, ma'am. He's good company. After they said their goodbyes, Thomas sat for a long moment, the handset cradled in his weathered hands. Maxwell nudged his arm, those intelligent eyes asking a question Thomas couldn't answer. Well, boy, he finally said, guess we better enjoy our last evening together. But as he scratched behind Maxwell's ears, he wondered about the woman on the phone. Beneath the polished exterior, he'd heard something familiar, the same loneliness that had driven him to these mountains after Sarah's death, the same search for something real in a world that often felt anything but. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. For tonight, there was still time for one more story by the fire, one more quiet moment of connection before their brief chapter together came to an end. Thomas reached for his battered copy of Call of the Wild, and Maxwell settled into his now customary spot by the hearth, both of them pretending that this wasn't a goodbye. Dawn crept over the mountains with hesitant fingers of light, finding Thomas already awake, sitting in his usual chair. He hadn't slept much. Maxwell dozed nearby, his bandaged paw tucked underneath him, occasional twitches suggesting dreams of chasing something through his sleep, or perhaps running toward something. The old photo album lay open in Thomas's lap, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. He rarely looked at it anymore. Memories were safer kept locked away, viewed only in small doses. But this morning felt different. Maybe it was Maxwell's presence, or the thought of the coming meeting. But Thomas found himself turning pages, facing the past one photograph at a time. There he was in his dress uniform, standing straight and proud beside Sarah on their wedding day. Her smile still pierced him. How she'd looked at him like he was something special, not just another broken soldier trying to find his way home. More pages, their small house in town before the mountain cabin, Sarah's garden in full bloom, the life they'd built together. The last few pages were emptier. After her diagnosis, they'd stopped taking so many pictures, as if by capturing viewer moments, they could somehow slow time itself. Maxwell stirred, padding over to rest his head on Thomas's knee. His eyes moved between Thomas's face and the album, showing that uncanny understanding that had marked their brief time together. Suppose I should make myself presentable, Thomas said, closing the album. Maxwell's tail wagged once, tentatively, as if he wasn't sure whether to be happy or sad about the coming day. The cabin itself didn't take long to straighten up. Thomas's military habits meant everything generally stayed in its place. Still, he found himself wiping down surfaces that didn't need it, straightening books that were already aligned, his movements becoming more mechanical as the clock ticked toward 8. In his bedroom, he stood before the small mirror, studying his reflection with a critical eye. The face that looked back was weathered but dignified, white hair neatly trimmed. The beard he'd grown after Sarah's passing kept clean and short. He chose his best flannel shirt, dark blue, Sarah's favorite color, and the least worn pair of jeans. Not trying to impress anyone, he told Maxwell, who had followed him into the room, just showing proper respect. The dog's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Thomas's hands hesitated over his medals, tucked away in their box in the top drawer. He never wore them, not even for Veterans Day ceremonies he no longer attended. But something made him pause today, looking at the bronze and silver symbols of a life lived long ago. After a moment, he closed the drawer. Some things belonged to the past. The drive into town would take 20 minutes, but Thomas found himself ready an hour early, too restless to sit still. Maxwell seemed to pick up on his energy, moving between the window and the door, his usual calm demeanor slightly ruffled. One last patrol around the property, Thomas suggested. Maxwell's enthusiasm for the idea was immediate, and soon they were walking their now familiar route around the cabin's perimeter. The morning air was crisp, carrying the first hints of the coming winter. Their breath formed small clouds in the dawn light. They passed the garden, where late autumn vegetables still clung to life under their protective coverings. Past the woodpile, stacked high and neat for the coming cold. Around the tool shed, where Thomas kept his father's old equipment, maintained now more out of habit than necessity. Each landmark held memories of the past 2 days. Maxwell's first exploration of the property, their shared meals on the porch, quiet moments that had filled an empty space Thomas hadn't known needed filling. At the edge of the clearing where the maintained yard gave way to wild forest, Thomas stopped. This was where he'd first seen Maxwell, limping through the morning fog. Now the dog stood tall and strong beside him, his injury almost healed, ready to return to his life of luxury in Boston. "You know," Thomas said quietly, "it's not just the company I'll miss. It's—" He paused, searching for words. "It's the way you see things, like everything's worth noticing, worth caring about." Maxwell pressed against his leg, warm and solid and real. "Been a long time since I looked at the world that way." The sun was higher now, the mountains casting long shadows across the valley below. Time to go. Thomas took one last look at his cabin, at the life he'd built here in his solitude. For the first time in years, he wondered if perhaps there was such a thing as too much peace, too much distance from the world's complexity. "Come on then," he said to Maxwell. "Let's get you home." Caroline's diner hadn't changed in 30 years. The same red vinyl booths lined the windows, their cracks carefully repaired with duct tape. The same coffee-stained counter hosted a row of regulars, each claiming their usual spot with the territorial certainty of long-time habit. The bell above the door still announced every arrival with a cheerful jingle that somehow managed to sound exactly like 1955. Thomas sat in his usual corner booth. Maxwell settled calmly at his feet. He'd arrived 20 minutes early, ordering coffee more out of courtesy than desire. The regulars had already done their double takes at Maxwell's presence. Dogs weren't usually allowed, but Caroline had taken one look at Thomas's face and nodded her permission. The bell chimed again, and Thomas knew immediately it was her. Catherine Windsor stood in the doorway, sunlight haloing her figure, looking simultaneously exactly and nothing like he'd imagined. Her clothes were expensive but understated, casual slacks and a soft sweater that probably cost more than his monthly pension. But it was her eyes that caught his attention, sharp, intelligent, and carrying a weight that her polished exterior couldn't quite hide. Maxwell's reaction was immediate. His tail thumped against Thomas's boot, but he didn't move, looking between Thomas and Catherine as if unsure which way his loyalty should pull. "Go on, boy," Thomas said softly. "She's come a long way." Maxwell rose and padded toward Catherine, his movements dignified despite his obvious joy. She dropped to her knees right there in the doorway, designer slacks meeting worn linoleum, all pretense of sophistication forgotten as she wrapped her arms around her dog's neck. "Oh, Maxwell," she whispered, her voice thick. "What were you thinking?" "Running so far?" The dog responded by licking her face, causing a laugh that sounded suspiciously like a sob. Thomas watched the reunion with a curious mix of emotions. Joy at seeing Maxwell's happiness, a sharp pang at knowing their time together was ending, and something else, an unexpected appreciation for the way Catherine Windsor had just shown her heart to a diner full of strangers. She rose, finally, composing herself with visible effort, and made her way to Thomas's booth. Maxwell walked beside her, but his eyes kept finding Thomas as if making sure he was still there. "Mr. Harrison." She extended her hand. "I can't thank you enough." Her handshake was firm, her fingers slightly calloused in a way that surprised him, not quite the pampered heiress he'd expected. "No thanks needed, ma'am. Any decent person would have done the same, would they?" She slid into the booth opposite him, Maxwell settling between them. "I've learned that decency isn't as common as one might hope." There was a story there, hidden behind her careful words. Caroline appeared with fresh coffee and menus, her eyebrows rising slightly at Catherine's presence, but maintaining her professional demeanor. Special occasion, Thomas. You usually take your coffee to go. Just helping reunite a friend with his family, Thomas replied, nodding toward Maxwell. Catherine studied him over her coffee cup, her designer boots a stark contrast to his worn work boots under the table. Tell me how you found him. Your email was concise. Thomas described that foggy morning, the first aid, the quiet evenings by the fire. With each detail, he watched Catherine's expression shift, moving from concern to relief to something deeper, understanding perhaps of what these days had meant to both man and dog. He read to you? She asked Maxwell, who thumped his tail in confirmation. The only thing I've ever read him is quarterly investment reports. She tried to make it sound like a joke, but the regret in her voice was clear. Never too late to start. Something new, Thomas offered, surprising himself with the words. Catherine's eyes met his, something unspoken passing between them. Her fingers found Maxwell's ears, scratching gently. No, she said softly. I suppose it's not. She glanced around the diner, taking in the peeling wallpaper, the mismatched coffee cups, the morning regulars now pretending not to watch their table. This coffee really is good. Best in Vermont, Thomas agreed, though they both knew that wasn't saying much. The conversation that followed was easier than either had expected. They talked about Maxwell's improving paw, about the mountain weather, about small things that somehow felt significant. Catherine's practice polish gradually softened, while Thomas found himself sharing more than he had in years. Maxwell moved between them, equally content with either human, as if he'd orchestrated this meeting himself. Through the diner's windows, the mountains stood silent and ancient, watching over them all with the patience of centuries. And in a booth with cracked vinyl and coffee ring stains, two people from very different worlds found themselves wondering if perhaps Maxwell's unexpected journey had been more than just a lost dog finding his way home. The first warning came from Maxwell. His ears perked up, head turning toward the diner's windows, while Thomas and Catherine were finishing their second cup of coffee. Thomas recognized the gesture. He'd seen the same alert posture in military. No dogs just before incoming fire. Storms coming, he said, cutting off Catherine's story about Maxwell's puppy days in France. The mountain had vanished behind a wall of dark clouds that seemed to have materialized from nowhere. Mountain weather, he explained, noting her surprised expression. Changes faster than stock prices up here. The first fat drops hit the diner's windows as Caroline approached their booth. Thomas, they're calling for flash floods in the valley. Road to Boston's already getting reports of washouts. Catherine reached for her phone, perfectly manicured nails tapping the screen. I can call my driver to... Begging your pardon, ma'am, Thomas interrupted gently, but that's not a good idea. These storms can turn deadly if you don't know the terrain. He watched the rain intensify, sheets of water now obscuring the world. Beyond the glass. My cabin's 15 minutes up the mountain. You and Maxwell would be welcome to wait it out there. The offer surprised them both. Thomas hadn't hosted a guest since Sarah's wake, and from Catherine's expression, accepting hospitality in a stranger's mountain cabin wasn't part of her usual social calendar. Maxwell made a soft whining sound, pressing against Catherine's leg. As thunder rolled overhead, she looked down at her dog, then back at Thomas. In his eyes, she saw only genuine concern and something else, a quiet dignity that made her designer clothes and wealth feel suddenly meaningless. Thank you, she said softly. That's very kind. The drive up the mountain was tense. Thomas's old truck handled the increasingly treacherous road with practiced ease, but Catherine's knuckles were white where they gripped the door handle. Maxwell sat between them on the bench seat, his presence somehow reassuring to both. A chess set was a wedding gift, Thomas found himself explaining as they entered the cabin, more to fill the awkward silence than anything else. The handcrafted pieces stood on their board by the window, frozen mid-game from his solitary matches. Sarah taught me to play, said it would help quiet my mind after coming home from the war. Catherine moved closer to the set, admiring the intricate carving of each piece. It's beautiful, My father tried to teach me, but I was always too impatient, too focused on the next big thing to appreciate the quiet moments. Thunder cracked overhead, making them both jump. Maxwell pressed against Catherine's legs as the storm raged outside, his earlier confidence somewhat diminished by the noise. "Fire first," Thomas said, moving to the wood stove with practiced efficiency. "Gets cold up here quick when storms roll in." Catherine watched him work, noting the precise economy of his movements. Everything in the cabin had its place, she realized. Everything served a purpose. It was as far from her cluttered penthouse as possible, and yet somehow she felt more at ease than she had in months. "Would you like to learn?" Thomas gestured to the chess set once the fire was crackling. "Seems we have time." The smile that crossed Catherine's face was genuine, lacking the practiced polish she usually wore. "I'd like that very much." As Thomas set up the pieces, explaining each one's movements with patient detail, the storm raged beyond the cabin's walls. Maxwell settled by the fire, watching his two humans with apparent satisfaction as they began to play. "The pawn," Thomas explained, holding up the smallest piece, "is like the common soldier, limited in movement, but capable of great things if it reaches the other side." He smiled slightly. "Sometimes the smallest pieces make the biggest difference." Catherine studied the board, then looked at Maxwell, remembering how this unexpected detour had begun. "Yes," she said softly, "I'm beginning to understand that." Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside the cabin, something else was beginning to fall as well. The carefully constructed walls between two very different lives, brought together by a runaway dog and a mountain storm. Morning light filtered through clearing skies, casting long shadows across Thomas's kitchen. The old recipe book lay open on the counter, its pages spotted with age and use. Sarah's handwriting filled the margins, little notes about extra, cinnamon in the pancakes, reminders to let the batter rest. Catherine watched as Thomas's weathered fingers traced the familiar instructions, following a ritual decades in the making. "Sarah always said breakfast was more about the company than the food," Thomas said, measuring flour with military precision. "Course, she was just being kind. Took me years to make anything edible." Catherine sat at the small kitchen table, wrapped in one of Sarah's old quilts, her designer clothes from yesterday looking somehow out of place in the morning light. Maxwell dozed nearby, his dreams punctuated by occasional soft woofs. "I can't remember the last time I actually cooked something," Catherine admitted, cradling a mug of coffee between her palms. "My apartment has this gorgeous kitchen, granite countertops, professional grade everything. Makes for great photos in Architectural Digest, but—" She trailed off, watching Thomas work. "But it's not a home," he finished quietly. "No," the word came out, barely above a whisper. "It's not." The night had changed something between them. After 3 games of chess, all of which Catherine had lost spectacularly, they'd talked, really talked, about Sarah's battle with cancer, about Catherine's marriage crumbling under the weight of expectations and appearances, about the different kinds of loneliness that could exist in a mountain cabin and a city penthouse. "First batch might be a bit rough," Thomas warned, pouring batter onto the cast-iron griddle that had been Sarah's grandmother's. "Been a while since I've cooked for anyone but myself." Catherine smiled, remembering their chess matches. "I'm getting used to your warnings, Mr. Harrison. So far they've all turned out better than promised." The compliment brought a slight flush to Thomas's cheeks. He focused on the pancakes, but Catherine caught the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Maxwell stirred at the smell of cooking, padding over to rest his head on Catherine's lap. Her fingers found his ears automatically, but her eyes stayed on Thomas. There was something fascinating about watching him work, each movement deliberate, nothing wasted, so different from her world of excess and show. "My mother would be horrified," she said suddenly. "Spending the night in a stranger's cabin, wearing yesterday's clothes, eating breakfast without checking the chef's Michelin stars first." "And how do you feel about it?" Thomas asked, sliding a perfectly golden pancake onto a plate. Catherine looked around the kitchen, at the well-worn counters, the carefully organized shelves, the morning light painting everything in shades of hope. I feel real. For the first time in longer than I can remember. Thomas set a plate in front of her, the pancakes steaming gently. A small jar of wild blackberry preserves, his own, he explained, sat beside it. Catherine took a bite and closed her eyes. It wasn't the finest breakfast she'd ever had, technically speaking. The pancakes were a little uneven, the preserves a bit too sweet, but somehow it was perfect. Sarah's recipe, Thomas said softly, settling across from her with his own plate. She'd be glad to know it's still bringing comfort to people who need it. Is that what you think I need? Comfort. Thomas considered this, cutting his pancakes with thoughtful precision. I think maybe we all need someone to see us, really see us, not just what we show the world. He glanced at Maxwell, who was watching the exchange with bright eyes. Sometimes it takes a runaway dog to make us stop running from ourselves. Catherine felt something shift in her chest. A wall crumbling, or maybe a door opening. Outside, the mountain stood peaceful after the storm, its strength somehow both imposing and comforting. Like the man sitting across from her, who had shown more genuine kindness in one day than she'd experienced in years of charity galas and society functions. Thank you, she said, meaning far more than just the breakfast. Always welcome at my table, Thomas replied, and they both knew he meant more than just meals. The local newspaper sat between them on Caroline's counter, its front page dominated by storm damage reports. But it was the small article in the corner that had caught Catherine's attention. Mountain Haven Inn reopens under new management. The black and white photo showed a Victorian building at the edge of town, its wraparound porch offering a clear view of Thomas's mountain. Betty's place, Thomas explained, noting her interest. Her daughter's taken it over, fixing it up real. Nice. He sipped his coffee, watching as Catherine's fingers traced the photo's edges. Maxwell sat at attention between their stools, his head swiveling between them like he was following a tennis match. It's beautiful, Catherine said softly. Then, with a casualness that didn't quite ring true, I don't suppose they have any vacancies? Thomas's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. The morning sun through Caroline's windows caught the silver in his hair, making it gleam like new snow. Thought you had meetings back in Boston. Foundation business, wasn't it? Catherine's phone lay face down on the counter, ignored despite its occasional buzzing. The foundation has survived without me before. During the divorce, she trailed off, then squared her shoulders. I told myself then that I was staying away to protect the organization's reputation. But really I was hiding, from Marcus, from the press, from everything. And now I think maybe I need to stop hiding, but not by running back to board meetings and charity galas. She turned to face him fully. I need to figure out who. Catherine Windsor is without all the trappings. Maxwell figured it out before I did, didn't you, boy? The dog's tail thumped against the diner's worn linoleum. Thomas studied her for a long moment. The Catherine Windsor who sat beside him now was different from the polished heiress who had walked into his life yesterday. Her hair was pulled back, in a simple ponytail, her face bare of makeup, wearing clothes borrowed from the general store after the storm. She looked younger somehow, more real. Town's quiet, he said finally. Might not be what you're used to. Good. Catherine's smile held a hint of mischief. I'm tired of what I'm used to. She reached for her phone, finally acknowledging its existence. I should make some calls. Let the foundation know I'm taking a leave of absence. My assistant can handle the day-to-day operations. Taking a page from Maxwell's book, Thomas asked, his eyes twinkling. Running away to the mountains? Not running away, Catherine corrected, scratching Maxwell's ears. Running toward something. I'm just not quite sure what yet. Caroline appeared with fresh coffee, pretending not to listen, but failing to hide her smile. The morning regulars were doing a poor job of concealing their interest too, their newspapers failing to mask their glances toward the counter. Well, Thomas said, rising from his stool. Dog needs his morning walk. Doctor's orders. He looked at Catherine, his invitation clear but unspoken. Catherine glanced down at her borrowed boots, practical things meant for mountain paths, not city sidewalks. For the first time in her life, she found herself preferring them to her designer. Collection. I suppose I should see more of the town if I'm staying, she said, standing as well. Maxwell's tail wagged harder, his eyes bright with what looked suspiciously like satisfaction. As they stepped out into the crisp morning air, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the pure, simple excitement of not knowing what came next. The mountain rose before them, solid and eternal, its slopes painted with autumn colors that no designer could ever quite capture. The inn's about a mile that way, Thomas said, pointing down the town's main street. Nice walk on a morning like this. And so Catherine Windsor, heiress and philanthropist, found herself walking down a small town street with an elderly veteran and a golden retriever, while her phone buzzed ignored in her pocket. Somewhere her mother was probably having palpitations at the very thought. The realization made her smile wider. You know, she said as they walked, I think Maxwell had the right idea all along. Thomas's answering chuckle was warm as the morning. Son, dogs usually do, in my experience. They know what matters. Maxwell, trotting happily between them, couldn't have agreed more. A bundle of dried herbs hung from Thomas's porch, their subtle fragrance carried on the afternoon breeze. Catherine watched as he carefully separated the leaves from their stems, his movements precise and practiced. Maxwell lay nearby in a patch of sunlight, content to observe their lesson. Wild thyme, Thomas explained, placing a sprig in Catherine's palm. Best kind of medicine there is, according to Sarah. She used to say nature provides everything we need, if we just know where to look. Catherine brought the herb closer, inhaling its sharp, clean scent. A week had passed since she'd checked into the Mountain Haven Inn, and each day had brought new discoveries. The herbs in her hand were nothing like the perfectly trimmed garnishes that adorned plates at five-star restaurants. These were wild, real, carrying the essence of the mountain itself. How do you know which ones are safe? She asked, genuinely. Curious. Her childhood education had covered corporate law and social etiquette, but nothing about finding food and medicine in the wilderness. Thomas's eyes crinkled with amusement. Same way I learned everything important in life, making mistakes and having good teachers. He gestured toward a patch of similar-looking plants near the forest's edge. See those? Look almost the same, but the leaves are different. One's dinner, the other's a good way to meet your maker. Catherine shuddered slightly, but found herself smiling. Not quite like picking out produce at Whole Foods. No, ma'am, Thomas agreed, sorting another handful of herbs. But more satisfying once you know what you're doing. He paused, studying her face. You're getting some color in your cheeks. Mountain air agrees with you. She touched her face self-consciously. A week without her usual cosmetics routine had felt strange at first, but now, the inn's mirror tells me I look terrible. No spa treatments, no salon visits, not even a decent moisturizer. Mirror's lying, then, Thomas said simply, returning to his herbs. The matter-of-fact compliment brought more color to Catherine's cheeks than a week of mountain air had managed. Maxwell chose that moment to rise and stretch, padding over to nose at the herb bundle. No, boy, Catherine found herself saying, before Thomas could. Those aren't for eating. The dog gave her a look of exaggerated innocence that made both humans laugh. He's a good teacher too, Thomas observed. Knows when to push and when to let be. He began tying the sorted herbs into neat bundles. Saw him leading you down to the creek yesterday. Catherine smiled at the memory. She'd been trying to read on the inn's porch, her tablet filled with foundation reports she felt obligated to review. Maxwell had appeared, gently but persistently tugging her sleeve until she followed him. They'd spent an hour by the water, doing nothing more important than watching leaves float downstream. I keep waiting, she admitted, accepting another herb. bundle to tie, waiting to feel bored or restless or guilty about not being productive. But instead I feel present, Thomas suggested. Yes, the word came out almost like a sigh. I've spent so many years thinking about the next quarter's projections, the next fundraiser, the next board meeting. Always the next thing, never the current moment. Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. War taught me that lesson. You spend enough time not knowing if you'll see another sunset, you learn to appreciate the one you've got. He gestured at the mountain rising behind his cabin. These hills have been here longer than any of us, seen more changes than we can imagine. They've got a way of putting things in perspective. Catherine looked at her hands, now smudged with earth and green from the herbs. A week ago, she would have immediately reached for hand sanitizer. Now she found herself appreciating the evidence of real work, honest contact with the world around her. I never thanked you, she said suddenly. Thomas raised an eyebrow. For the herb lesson? For not judging me when I showed up in my ridiculous clothes with my ridiculous expectations. For seeing past, she gestured vaguely at herself, all of this. Nothing ridiculous about trying to find your way, Thomas replied. Besides, Maxwell had already vouched for you. He's got good taste in people. The dog's tail thumped against the porch boards at the sound of his name. Catherine reached out to scratch his ears, marveling at how this one creature had led her here, to this porch, this moment, this growing understanding of what really mattered. More herbs to gather before sunset, Thomas said, rising with only a slight stiffness in his movements. Care to learn some more? Catherine stood, brushing off her jeans, sturdy ones bought from the general store, already more comfortable than any designer pair she'd owned. Lead the way, Mr. Harrison. And so they walked together into the late afternoon light, Maxwell trotting ahead to scout their path, while overhead the wild thyme dried in the mountain breeze, filling the air with promises of healing. The letter arrived on crisp, legal stationery, delivered to the Mountain Haven Inn's front desk by private courier. Catherine sat on the inn's porch swing, the paper trembling slightly in her hands as she read. Maxwell, sensing her distress, pressed closer against her legs. Ms. Windsor, the letter began, all pretense of familiarity stripped away. Your continued absence from the Windsor Foundation board meetings has become untenable. Your recent behavior, including your disappearance to what my sources tell me is a remote mountain town, raises serious concerns about your capacity to fulfill your responsibilities. Marcus's signature sprawled across the bottom. As aggressive as she remembered, even his handwriting was a power play. Bad news? Thomas's voice startled her. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps, a basket of fresh vegetables from his garden in his arms. They'd fallen into an easy routine over the past 2 weeks. He'd bring extra produce from his garden. She'd share stories over coffee at Carolyn's. Simple exchanges that had come to mean more than all the charity galas in Boston. Catherine folded the letter carefully, buying time to steady her voice. Marcus is concerned about my extended absence. Thomas climbed the steps slowly, setting the basket down. Without asking, he lowered himself onto the swing beside her. Maxwell immediately shifted to lay across both their feet, as he'd taken to doing lately. Concerned about you or about losing control? Thomas asked quietly, the laugh that escaped. Catherine's throat was brittle. Both, probably. In Marcus's world, they're the same thing. She handed him the letter, watching as he read it with the same careful attention he gave to everything, from herb gathering to chess moves. Legal threats, Thomas observed, reaching the second page. Creative ones, too. Man knows how to wage war with words. It's what he does best. Catherine's fingers worried at the hem of her flannel shirt. Another general store purchase that would have horrified her former self. He's threatening to contest the divorce settlement unless I return to Boston immediately. Says my erratic behavior proves I'm not fit to manage my portion of the foundation. Thomas folded the letter deliberately, his weathered hands creasing each fold with military precision. What do you think? I think Catherine stood suddenly, pacing the porch while Maxwell watched with concerned eyes. I think for the first time in my life, I'm actually behaving sanely here in this tiny town, wearing clothes from the general store, learning about herbs and mountain weather and, she gestured helplessly, real things, important things. Sounds like you have your answer then. She turned to face him. Do I? The foundation does good work, Thomas, real good, not just tax write-off charity. We fund medical research, education programs, disaster relief, and none of that good work depends on you being miserable, Thomas said firmly. The foundation will survive without you chaining yourself to a desk in Boston. Marcus would say that's naive, that everything has a price, and if you're not willing to pay it... Marcus, Thomas interrupted, his voice gentle but firm, is not the mountain. Catherine blinked. What? The mountain doesn't care about legal threats or board meetings or what's proper. Thomas gestured toward the peak that dominated the horizon. It's real, solid, true to itself. Maybe that's why Maxwell led you here. At the sound of his name, Maxwell stood and moved to Catherine's side, pressing against her legs until she stopped pacing. She looked down at her dog, remembering how he'd run from the penthouse's pristine luxury to find this place. This truth. Marcus's letter says I have 48 hours to respond, she said quietly, to return to Boston and resume my proper place in society. Thomas nodded, picking up his basket of vegetables. Garden needs weeding tomorrow morning, he said casually. Could use an extra pair of hands if you're not too busy with society matters. Catherine felt something loosen in her chest. A knot of anxiety giving way to something stronger. She thought of the herbs drying on Thomas's porch, of morning coffee at Carolyn's, of Maxwell leading her to creekside revelations, of all the real things she'd discovered here. Well, she said, a smile tugging at her lips, I did promise. Caroline, I'd help her test new pie recipes this week. Would be rude to disappoint her. Thomas's eyes crinkled at the corners. Very rude, he agreed solemnly. Small towns run on pie and promises. Maxwell's tail wagged, thumping against the porch railing with enthusiastic approval. As Thomas descended the steps with his basket, Catherine watched him go, the threatening letter now feeling lighter in her hands. Let Marcus wage his paper war. She had herbs to learn about, gardens to weed, and pies to taste. She had real things to do. Catherine's grandmother's silver locket caught the firelight as she turned it over in her hands. The small, heart-shaped pendant had been at the bottom of her purse since she'd left Boston, forgotten until she'd emptied the bag while settling. Into the inn. Now, sitting in Thomas's living room while rain drummed against the windows, it seemed to hold memories like a time capsule. She was the only one who saw through it all, Catherine said softly, thumb tracing the worn engravings. The parties, the social obligations, the perfect Windsor heir persona. She'd slip me little notes during family functions, jokes, observations, reminders to stay true to myself. She clicked the locket open, revealing a tiny photo of a young girl laughing. I stopped wearing it after she died. It felt like I'd failed her somehow. Maxwell, curled up between them on the old sofa, lifted his head to nudge her hand. Thomas sat quietly, letting her words fill the space between them. The fire popped and crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. War changes you, Thomas said finally, his voice carrying the weight of memories. Not just combat, though God knows that's enough. It's the waiting. The constant awareness that everything can change in a heartbeat. You learn to live with it, or it consumes you. Catherine turned to face him, still holding the locket. Is that why you chose this place? The mountain? Partly. Thomas shifted, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. After Sarah passed, the silence in our house in town was deafening. Too many people offering help I wasn't ready for, sympathy I couldn't bear. Up here, he gestured to the windows, where rain streaked the glass like tears. Up here the silence has purpose. It's not empty. It's full of life, if you know how to listen. Like the herbs. Catherine said, understanding dawning. Learning. To see what's really there, not just what you expect to find. Thomas nodded. Sarah understood that. She'd been a nurse in the VA hospital where I did my physical therapy, saw past the broken soldier to the man underneath, taught me to do the same, to look deeper, find the truth of things. She sounds remarkable. She was. Thomas's smile held both sadness and gratitude. Would have liked you, I think. She had no patience for pretense either. Catherine laughed softly. I used to be nothing but pretense. The perfect daughter, the perfect wife, the perfect philanthropist. All carefully constructed, like those designer rooms no one actually lives in. And now she looked down at the locket, at her grandmother's fierce, bright spirit captured in silver. Now I'm learning to be messy, real. Her eyes met Thomas's. Scared sometimes, but real. Fear's not always bad, Thomas said. Kept me alive in Vietnam. Tells you when something matters enough to fight for. What are you afraid of now? The question slipped out before Catherine could stop it. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, the fire's glow softening the lines of his face. Change, he admitted finally. Getting used to someone else's presence in my life. Finding myself hoping they'll stay, knowing they probably shouldn't. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Maxwell raised his head, looking between them with wise eyes, as if watching a story unfold, exactly as he'd planned. Catherine's fingers closed around the locket. My grandmother used to say that the truest things in life rarely make sense on paper. That's why we have to learn to read with our hearts instead of our eyes. Smart woman. Yes, Catherine smiled, touching Maxwell's head gently. She also said that sometimes the best guides come in unexpected forms. I think she would have appreciated Maxwell's methods. Thomas chuckled. Leading us both exactly where we needed to go, whether we knew it or not. Do you think... Catherine paused, gathering courage. Do you think Sarah would mind? Me being here, learning her herbs, hearing her stories? Sarah believed joy was meant to be shared, Thomas said softly. That healing happens best in company. He reached out slowly, his weathered hand covering Catherine's, where it held the locket. Think maybe she and your grandmother might have been kindred spirits that way. Outside, the rain continued its gentle rhythm, but inside the cabin, something else was falling into place. Understanding, acceptance, and the quiet recognition that sometimes the heart finds its true path only after getting thoroughly lost first. The urgent business contracts lay scattered across Catherine's bed at the Mountain Haven Inn, their bold, immediate action required headers stark against the homey floral quilt. Her laptop displayed a dozen unread emails from the Foundation's board, their subject lines growing increasingly demanding. Maxwell watched from his spot by the window as she paced the worn wooden floors, phone pressed to her ear. No, Rachel. I understand the urgency, Catherine said to her assistant, but I need you to explain to the board that I'm not simply going to rubber stamp these decisions from afar. She paused, listening. Yes, I know Marcus is pushing for an emergency vote. He's been pushing for a lot of things lately. The autumn sunset painted the room in shades of amber, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. 3 weeks in this. Small Town had changed more than just her wardrobe and daily routine. It had shifted something fundamental in how she viewed her responsibilities, her purpose. The Children's Hospital project? Catherine stopped pacing, her attention caught. No, absolutely not. Tell Marcus we are not redirecting those funds to the tech initiative. I don't care how much positive press it would generate. Her voice grew firmer, finding its authority. The hospital expansion was Sarah's. Was my mother's last project before she died. It stays. A knock at her door made her turn. Thomas stood in the doorway, his expression concerned, but patient. He held a basket of fresh vegetables, their daily excuse for checking on each other. Rachel, I need to go. Yes, I'll review the contracts tonight. No, I'm not coming back to Boston. Not yet. She ended the call, letting out a long breath. Sorry about that. The Foundation's in an uproar. Heard it might be. Thomas said, setting the basket down. Caroline mentioned seeing something about it in the Boston papers. He didn't mention that he'd specifically asked the diner owner to keep an eye out for news about Catherine. Catherine picked up one of the contracts, its legal language now feeling foreign after weeks of learning Nature's simpler truths. Marcus is trying to reshape the Foundation's mission. More tech-focused initiatives, fewer direct community projects, better optics for potential investors, he says. And what do you say? She met his eyes, finding strength in their steady gaze. I say he's forgetting why the Foundation exists in the first place. My mother started it after my father died, to help families facing the same medical battles we did. It was never about optics or investor returns. Maxwell rose from his spot, padding over to nose at the contracts scattered on the bed. Catherine smiled despite herself. Yes, boy, I know what you think about paperwork. Smart dog, Thomas commented, leaning against the doorframe. Got his priorities straight. Catherine sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly exhausted. I have to make a decision, don't I? About all of this. She gestured to the contracts, the laptop, the pieces of her old, life-demanding attention. Seems to me you already have, Thomas said quietly. Just need to admit it to yourself. She looked up at him, this man who had somehow become essential to her understanding of what mattered. I can't abandon the Foundation. Too many people depend on it. Leading and abandoning aren't the same thing, Thomas pointed out. Sometimes you need distance to see things clearly, to fight the right battles the right way. Maxwell jumped onto the bed, deliberately settling on top of the contracts, his expression almost comically satisfied. Catherine laughed, reaching out to scratch his ears. You're not subtle, are you, boy? He's got a point, Thomas said, smiling. Hard to sign papers with a dog sitting on them. Catherine looked around the room, at the simple furniture, the view of the mountains, the basket of vegetables that represented so much more than just food. Then at the contracts under Maxwell, the demanding emails, the life that once seemed so important, but now felt hollow. You know, she said slowly, there's nothing that says I can't run a foundation from somewhere other than Boston. Thomas's eyes crinkled at the corners. Imagine not. World's gotten smaller that way or so. I hear. It would be unprecedented. The board would have fits. Marcus would... She paused, then laughed. Marcus would be furious, which honestly is becoming a point in favor. Maxwell's tail thumped against the contracts, creating a rhythmic counterpoint to her thoughts. Outside, the mountain stood solid and unchanging, offering the same quiet wisdom it had shared with generations before her. I need to make some calls, Catherine said finally, her voice stronger. Set up some video conferencing. Equipment. Establish a remote office. She looked at Thomas. Know any good spots in town with reliable internet? His smile widened. Might know a few. Been meaning to get connected myself, truth be told. Sarah always said I should keep up with the times. The moment hung between them, full of possibility. Maxwell, apparently satisfied with his role in their revelation, climbed off the contracts and headed for the door, looking back expectantly. Think he wants his evening walk, Thomas said. Catherine stood, deliberately leaving the contracts where they lay. Well, we shouldn't keep him waiting. The Foundation will still be there tomorrow, and together they walked out into the evening, light letting the mountain air clear away the last doubts about which path to choose. The empty dog bowl sat on Thomas's kitchen floor like a question mark. He'd almost picked it up that morning, but something had stopped him. Instead, he stood at his sink, watching the sunrise paint the mountain in shades of promise, while his coffee grew cold in his hands. Catherine had left at dawn. She needed to return to Boston, she'd explained the night before, to face the board in person, to make her stand about the Foundation's future, about her future. Maxwell had to go with her. He was still legally required to appear at the final divorce hearing as part of the custody agreement. It's just temporary, she'd said, but they both heard the uncertainty in her voice. The city had a way of reclaiming its own. The goodbye had been quiet, like most important things in mountain life. Maxwell had pressed his head against Thomas's leg for a long moment, those wise eyes saying more than words could manage. Catherine had stood by her rental car, looking small against the mountain's vast backdrop. "Thank you," she'd said simply. "For everything," Thomas had nodded, not trusting his voice. He'd watched them drive away, Maxwell's golden head visible in the back window, until the car disappeared around the bend. Now, hours later, the cabin felt emptier than it had in years. He moved through his morning routine with mechanical precision, made his bed with military corners, swept the porch where Maxwell's fur no longer collected in corners, checked the herbs drying in the kitchen, their familiar scent now carrying a hint of memory, Catherine's delight as she learned their names, their properties, their stories. The chess set caught his eye, pieces still arranged from their last game. She'd finally won, just yesterday. Her smile had been triumphant, unguarded, real. He remembered Sarah's words about the game being a teacher of patience, of strategy, of knowing which pieces to risk and which to protect. Mid-morning brought Caroline herself up the mountain path, a rare occurrence that spoke to the significance of the day. "Brought you some pie," she said without preamble, setting a wrapped dish on his counter. Catherine's recipe, if you can believe it. Girl took to baking like she was born to it once. She stopped worrying about doing it perfectly. Thomas managed a small smile. "She's a quick study." Caroline looked around the cabin, noting the empty dog bowl, the two tidy spaces. "You know, she left something at the diner. Asked me to give it to you when the time was right." She pulled an envelope from her pocket, setting it beside the pie. "Reckon now's that time." After she left, Thomas stood looking at the envelope for a long while. His name was written on the front in Catherine's elegant hand, though he noticed a small smudge in one corner, evidence of her new habit of gardening without gloves, of letting life leave its marks. Inside was a single page, the letter itself. Brief, "Dear Thomas, some battles need to be fought up close, but the mountain has taught me that the best vantage point often requires stepping back to see the whole picture clearly. Thank you for helping me find my true north. Save my place." At Caroline's counter, "Maxwell and I may need it sooner than you think. Catherine," he read it 3 times, each reading revealing new layers, like the mountain showing different faces as the sun moved across the sky. Then he walked to his front porch, where the mountain stood eternal and knowing. The empty dog bowl. Could wait a little longer. Some endings, after all, were just beginnings in disguise. The penthouse felt like a museum after the warmth of the mountain. Catherine stood at her floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the Boston skyline, while Maxwell lay curled up in his old bed, somehow managing to look both comfortable and vaguely disapproving. The city lights sparkled below, a man-made constellation that once represented everything she thought she wanted. "Ms. Windsor?" Her assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "The board members are assembled in the conference room." Catherine checked her reflection in the window. She wore one of her old power suits, the kind of armor she'd once relied on daily. Now it felt stiff, constraining, like a costume from a former life. Her hand went to her throat, where her grandmother's locket now hung openly instead of being tucked away in her purse. "Coming, Rachel." The Foundation's conference room hadn't changed, all gleaming mahogany and leather chairs, with views that reminded everyone present of their lofty position above the city. Marcus sat at the head of the table, his smile as practiced as everything else about him. "Catherine," he said, standing, "so good of you to finally join us, though I must say your rural sabbatical has caused quite a bit of concern." The other board members shifted uncomfortably. These were people she'd known for years, who'd attended her wedding, who'd supported her mother's vision for the foundation. Now they looked at her like she was a problem to be solved. "I've reviewed the proposed changes to our funding priorities," Catherine said, taking her seat. Maxwell settled at her feet, his presence giving her strength. "The answer is no." Marcus's smile tightened. "Catherine, be reasonable. The tech initiative would put us at the forefront of philanthropic innovation. Your mother's traditional approaches are outdated." "My mother," Catherine said quietly. Understood that real change happens on the ground, not in spreadsheets. She opened her portfolio, pulling out photos she'd taken in the mountain town. While I was away, I saw what genuine community looks like, how people help each other without press releases or tax benefits. Charming, Marcus said dismissively, but hardly relevant to running a multi-million-dollar foundation. Catherine felt something shift inside her, the last piece of a puzzle falling into place. She looked around the table, seeing the trappings of power for what they were. Just trappings. Actually, she said, her voice growing stronger, it's completely relevant. We've lost our way, chasing metrics and prestige. The Children's Hospital project isn't just my mother's legacy. It's a real place where real families find hope, just like the rural medical clinics we fund, the domestic violence shelters we support, the education programs we run. She stood, Maxwell rising with her. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to inform you of changes. The Foundation's headquarters is relocating. I've already found the perfect building in a small Vermont town. The room erupted in protests. Marcus's face darkened. You can't be serious. The logistics alone are already arranged, Catherine interrupted. Modern technology is wonderful that way. We can do all our work remotely while staying connected to the communities we serve. And yes, Marcus, I've already checked. As majority shareholder, I have full authority to make this decision. She touched her grandmother's locket, drawing strength from its presence. We're going back to our roots, real help for real people. Any board member who doesn't share that vision is welcome to resign. The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine looked out the windows at the city below, remembering Thomas's words about the mountain's wisdom, about seeing things clearly. From the right vantage point, Catherine, Marcus started, his tone wheedling, think about what you're giving up. Your position in society, your influence. She laughed, the sound genuine and free. I'm not giving up anything that matters. I'm choosing something better. She gathered her things, Maxwell already heading for the door. The Foundation's lawyers will be in touch with the relocation details. I have a mountain to get back to. In the elevator heading down, Catherine caught her reflection in the polished doors. Her suit still felt like a costume, but her eyes were bright, alive with purpose. Maxwell pressed against her leg, his tail wagging slightly. You knew all along, didn't you? She said softly. That's why you ran away, to show me the way home. The city spread out before them as they left the building, its shadows and lights, no longer holding the same power over her. Somewhere north, a mountain was waiting, its quiet wisdom calling her back. And maybe, just maybe, so was someone else who had learned to see past life's trappings to what really mattered. The for sale sign in front of the small cottage caught the late afternoon light, its sold banner fluttering in the mountain breeze. Catherine stood beside her packed car, Maxwell already halfway up the path to Thomas's cabin, his tail wagging. With barely contained excitement, she'd timed their return to match the hour when Thomas usually tended his herb garden. From where she stood, she could see him kneeling among the plants, his movements deliberate and practiced. He hadn't noticed them yet, focused on his task with characteristic attention. The past week had been a blur of activity, signing papers for the cottage purchase, arranging the Foundation's relocation, dealing with the media storm that followed. Her announcement. Through it all, the mountain had been a constant presence in her mind, like a compass pointing toward true north. Maxwell reached the garden first. Thomas looked up at the sound of approaching paws, his hands going still among the herbs. For a moment, he seemed to think he was imagining things. The dog he'd rescued, the woman standing by the car, the future suddenly unfolding before him. Thought you might need a gardening assistant, Catherine called, her voice carrying easily. In the mountain air, I hear the herbs are particularly stubborn this time of year. Thomas stood slowly, brushing soil from his hands. Maxwell danced around him, unable to contain his joy at the reunion. They can be, Thomas replied, his voice carefully neutral, but his eyes saying so much more. Takes a special kind of patience to help them grow. Catherine walked up the path, each step feeling more right than the last. She gestured toward the cottage, visible through the trees. I hope you don't mind having neighbors. The real estate agent said it hasn't been lived in for years. Good solid house, Thomas said, looking at the cottage. Sarah's sister used to live there. Always said it had the best morning light in the valley. He paused, studying Catherine's face. Permanent move? The foundation's relocating here. She smiled, touching her grandmother's locket. Turns out you can run a philanthropic organization from anywhere these days, especially somewhere that reminds you why the work matters. In the first place, Maxwell sat between them, his gaze bouncing back and forth like he was watching the most interesting tennis match in history. Thomas's lips twitched. Dog seems pretty pleased with himself. He should be. None of this would have happened if he hadn't decided to run away and find you. Catherine took a deep breath of mountain air. He led me right where I needed to be. Just took me a while to figure that out. Thomas looked at her for a long moment, seeing past the designer clothes she'd already started replacing with more practical options, past the society heiress to the woman who'd learned to gather herbs and bake pies and find joy in simple truths. Well, he said finally, garden's not going to weed itself, and these mountain herbs can be tricky if you don't know their ways. Catherine felt warmth spread through her chest. Good thing I have an excellent teacher. Might need to check that cottage's kitchen too, Thomas added, trying to sound casual. Make sure it's properly stocked for pie making. Caroline's been missing her taste tester. I suppose Maxwell and I could help with that. Catherine knelt, down to join him in the garden, her hands finding the familiar plants. Though I warn you, I'm getting better at chess. Might actually start winning regularly. Thomas's chuckle was warm as the afternoon sun, looking forward to it. Around them, the mountains stood steady and wise, watching as life fell into place, like pieces of a puzzle finally finding their home. Maxwell flopped down between them, content in the knowledge that his mission, leading two souls to where they needed to be, was finally perfectly complete. The shared garden flourished between the two properties, a living testament to how separate lives could grow together. Summer flowers mingled with medicinal herbs, Sarah's old plants finding new purpose alongside Catherine's experimental additions. Maxwell had worn a path between the cottage and cabin, his daily rounds including regular checks on both porches, both humans, both places he now called home. 3 months had passed since Catherine's return. The foundation's relocation had caused a brief media sensation, but like most storms, it had passed. Now the old general store's second floor hosted a state-of-the-art office where Catherine conducted video meetings with healthcare providers and education specialists, while downstairs local residents shopped for groceries and shared town gossip. Thomas stood in their garden, watching the sunset paint the mountain in familiar glory. The evening ritual of sharing stories over tea had become as natural as breathing. Catherine would bring fresh-baked pie or bread, still learning but improving with each attempt. He would share new herbs he'd discovered, or old memories that felt safer to visit now that they had someone to hear them. The children's hospital expansion breaks ground next month, Catherine said, joining him in the garden. She'd been on calls all afternoon, but her voice carried excitement rather than exhaustion. The local contractors you recommended are perfect. They understand exactly what we're trying to achieve. Maxwell appeared from wherever he'd been surveying his domain, greeting them both with equal enthusiasm. The dog had grown impossibly smug about his role in bringing them together, accepting treats and praise as his due. Sarah would have loved this, Thomas said quietly, looking at the thriving garden. The way it's all come together, she always said gardens were proof that broken things could grow into something beautiful. Catherine slipped her hand into his, the gesture as natural as the mountain air they breathed. Think she would have approved of all of this? She would have adored you, Thomas assured her. Probably would have shared all my embarrassing stories just to keep me humble. Too late, Catherine teased. "Caroline's already taken care of that." There, laughter mingled with the evening bird songs. The mountain looked on, ancient and wise, watching as love bloomed like their carefully tended herbs, slowly, steadily, with deep roots and stronger for the waiting. Inside Thomas's cabin, the big chess set waited for their evening game. In Catherine's cottage, fresh-baked bread cooled on the counter, and between these two homes, a garden grew, tended by 4 hands that had found their purpose in sharing not just the work, but the life that came with it. Maxwell sat between them, his mission long since accomplished, content now to simply watch. Over his family, after all, some treasures once found need only to be cherished. Some paths once discovered lead exactly where the heart needs to go. The mountain would keep their story, as it had kept so many others. Of how a lost dog had led an heiress to a veteran's door. Of how love could bloom in life's autumn, sweet and unhurried as mountain time. Of how sometimes the greatest adventures don't require traveling far, just opening your heart to the possibility that home might be closer than you think. As darkness settled over the valley, lights glowed warm in 2 windows, and the evening air carried the scent of herbs, the promise of tomorrow, and the quiet certainty that sometimes the best endings are really just better beginnings. And Maxwell, wise soul that he was, couldn't have agreed more.